I am so pleased to welcome to our virtual stage the fantastic founder of Everledger, Leanne Kemp, who's going to tell us, as you can see on the screen, there we go, you've made it very easy for me, Leanne, trusted supply chain, provenance and traceability. Over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I guess my presentation today is a little bit more practical in so much what it takes to build a trusted protocol across supply chains. I began Everledger in 2015 and was completely intrigued by incredibly conflicted and seriously opaque markets. And so we began tracking diamonds from the source of the mine right the way through to the retail network. Close to 9 years later, you could walk now into a Tiffany store and ask where a diamond comes from, and we're able to source and prove that trusted supply chain through various sets of mechanisms. We're a blockchain company, but blockchain alone will not provide for provenance. It has to come together in a symphony of technologies to enable that trust layer to be built. And distributed technologies like blockchain, I think, play an important role because obviously honey pots of data in centralized control is certainly a thing of the past. And as we start to embark upon even more greater transparency in supply chains, I'm curious about the data protocols that will be built and what types of data points industry are beckoning to bring together that sort of trusted provenance and traceability. So today I'm not talking about diamonds, I'm actually talking about critical minerals, because it occurred to me within the first year of Everledger what potentially could be the largest, most conflicted supply chain by 2030. And it plagued my mind. If we knew and understood the travesties that unfolded around blood diamonds, what potentially could be the next blood disaster that we could avoid. And the coining of the phrase was blood batteries, lithium-ion batteries, the critical minerals supply chain. And that's definitely become a heightened topic, not only from political leaders, but onshoring with bringing manufacturing back. And then you're starting to see this geopolitical separation and tension across the world as we start to grapple with a really important resource and how we can transition into renewable energy. So suffice to say, since 2016, a year after Everledger began, when I was the global chair for the World Economic Forum in advanced manufacturing, the Global Battery Alliance and the thought around that was given birth in the Geneva head office. And since that time, we see now many governments taking a hold of what we call the battery directive, particularly in Europe. And that's sparking a significant amount of flagging interest in mining companies right the way through to the end supply itself in batteries. And this trusted supply chain isn't necessarily just driven on which country does it come from. It also looks at where does it go to after it leaves me. So provenance is also a forward-looking lens. We think about end of life. What does that do when we talk about a battery? How do you disassemble and reassemble this battery and repurpose and recycle these materials? And so when I think about the work now over the better part of the last 6 years, it's very clear that battery regulation is groundbreaking reform, particularly in the EU, and it covers the entire life cycle and mandate of the product being an ore body in the ground, right the way through to the physical asset itself. And the regulation categories that have really become amplified, particularly over the last number of years through Europe. And what I'm showing you today is the output of the work with the German government under the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. And it really amplifies the life cycle stages across the supply chain and the types of categorizations that governments are interested in. Interestingly, in the diamond industry, it was a lot of pressure on industry was placed because of the questions coming from consumers, and regulation followed. This is quite the opposite. Regulation is leading in so much that they are looking at these categorizations and the requirements. You'll see across life cycle stages that in material sourcing and production, that sort of early stage processing really arches across each of these regulation categories, from the restriction of substances right the way through to the carbon footprint, and then even the waste battery management in terms of its end of life. And so it does beg the question, where do we go to from here? And I'm curious not only about the physical supply chain element, but also this mirroring of the digital supply chain element. And so as we start to see, a lot of this work is being led in 3 major jurisdictions. Clearly, it's Europe around the digital product passports. And that's not just limited to the supply chain of critical minerals or batteries. We're seeing this in textiles, in diamonds. We're seeing it in agriculture. So digital product passports are here to stay. It's a concept that involves the creation of a digital record of a product environment and social impact throughout its entire lifespan. And arguably, it's been driven as a key tool for advancing this European twin transition that many, many industry bodies and leaders are now embracing. Massive initiatives across in China, as well as in the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly in the US, specifically as it relates to the tax credit for electric vehicle batteries, which is driving a significance of this work. But did we really untrust this industry in the first instance, or were we just purely opaque and unorganized? That's sort of still the question that's plaguing many people's minds. But the timeline for the European battery regulation was really driven from the adoption of the Commission proposal back in December 2020, right in the heart of the COVID crisis, right the way through now, where we start to see the evolution of this legislation already being contemplated in its secondary legislation process right the way out to 2032, with mandated vision for the battery passport adoption by 2027. And we're sitting right now at the precipice of protocols and understanding of supply chain across each of those data points. There's a content guide that was really provided out of this work with the German government under BAT-Pass, which was also a collective structure of the Global Battery Alliance as well. There is a long list of data attributes, so as well as the carbon footprint ruling and the end of life analysis. And when I see this sort of content guidance, it begs a question in my mind that arguably this sort of trust protocol, particularly in a digital form, has simply been missing. So we've had the wiring that's enabled us in a building, but at the moment we're now trying to put these light switches on so we can illuminate a supply chain. The question is, many people are thinking that it's a light switch, simply turn it on or off. But if you're as close to the action as we are, we know that it's a dimmer switch. It's going to take some time to refine the right level of illumination across the supply chain. This image in front of you depicts a really great positioning across the supply chain. And as you can see, it's circular, in so much that it looks at the mining, the refining, right the way through to the end user itself. And because we have extended producer responsibilities now, again, it's not good enough for a manufacturer to purely pass on the responsibility of its product in a post-life experience. There is policy that's being enacted now that enables that end of life to become the responsibility of the automotive OEM, not just the battery producer themselves. So an entirely new burgeoning industry is coming to the forefront. Multi-trillion-dollar industry is being born purely out of the collector, the recycler, the refurbisher market itself. And it begs a question in my mind: what type of new business models will evolve from the enablement of traceability, particularly with critical minerals, and whether that mineral itself, who will own it, who will have the right to process it, and who will have the right to on-sell it. There are 7 content clusters now that arguably make up the digital product passport, but these are the trust protocols or the trust layer of data that needs to be intertwined. There's the general battery information itself around the manufacturer. There's the compliance, label, and certifications. Some of this compliance, labeling, and certifications has long stood as an external validated third-party attribute. But if we start to think about a total connected supply chain in the way that we're building it today, the role of auditors and the role of those intermediaries fundamentally change with the evolution of technologies like blockchain. The battery carbon footprint, circularity, battery materials, supply chain due diligence in its own form, and then the performance and durability. When we think about this, I think that we have had long-term trust structures in place, typically driven by financial institutions like KYC, Know Your Customer. But as the evolution of this has risen over the course of the last 8 years, we're really building an entirely new approach to KYO. It's a knockout punch, if you think about it. It's know your object. That object level data, as well as know your supplier, is going to become the most powerful connection across a supply chain. This is a visualization of what a battery passport looks like. Some of this data had already existed in industry, and a significant amount of it was actually not existing. And so therein lies the challenge for the supply chain and many participants. When I think about a diamond supply chain, it's clearly about 16 hops. A diamond is cut, is mined, it's a rock, it's validated, it's cross-bordered, it then runs to a certification, it's cut and polished, and then ultimately it is placed in a ring on a consumer's finger. But a supply chain like critical minerals, where there is precursor material, it's a far more complicated supply chain than simply digging a hole, extracting a rock and cutting it for a diamond. And therein lies the complexity. It's really made up of 4 main tabs, and this information and this prototype or pilot was released as a part of the World Economic Forum work in Davos in January this year. So this is only really 3 months in its ingestion stage. A second tab is around material. What is fascinating about this work is not only just the declaration that exists across the supply chain and where the materials have come from, but it also looks at the total reverse bill of materials of an object, the percentage of materials that have been physically traced, and the amount of coverage of those materials across the object that's being made. And the object in this instance is a battery itself. It begs in my mind the question, where does trust start and end? And is 4% or 2% in traceability elements enough? And without that underlying data, does that help to provide a degradation of trust? Because is 4% too small to trust some type of data that's validated, let alone no data? And I guess this question over time will start to erode the minds of consumers. The third tab is around ESG and the metrics. And it really digs into a series of questions, particularly around child labour and human rights. And it deeply looks at the algorithms around the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of this work has been dug deeply into the primary critical minerals themselves: lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and even vanadium in the new forms of battery free flow. And the third tab, which is what I'm most excited about, is really the data layer, this sort of digital value chain and the data value chain that needs to be built to enable trust of an object or enable trust of a supply chain. Broken down for a battery supply chain is mining, refining, precursing. You can see it on the screen. And yet it's also broken up into the identity of those companies involved in the supply chain, as well as the physical material flows and any of the ESG and sustainability related data. But as you can see in this sort of data value chain, there isn't certainly enough validated interoperable protocols that exist today that do enable us to be able to tick all of the boxes. And I know we have to start somewhere, but maybe starting with the end in sight enables us to build the right level of the data value chain, as well as the digital provenance, which will drive a lot of the consumer trust in the end. Supply chains and physical supply chains exist. However, digital supply chains are in its very early stages, and there isn't international protocols that enables us to mirror this digital provenance in a solid way. We are purely refitting digital provenance into a physical world. rather than designing for that digital provenance in the first output. The implementation of these rules is going to be regulated over a course of around 22 months and come into force with the battery regulation itself. And what is causing the greatest magnetic effect is clearly the decarbonisation of supply chains. And it's the key policy measure that is really driving this work towards the battery passport itself. So the carbon footprint and the repeated nature of that is something that is the large North Star that we're chasing. But again, we're still missing the other elements of concern around environment, particularly methane as the prime example. A battery regulation defines a specific carbon footprint reporting measurement, and it also reflects in the timelines that we see. Declarations in the first instance will not hold the threshold over time. And as we have been involved so deeply in a number of supply chains, Scope 3 feels like a very long tail fairy tale that isn't necessarily going to be easily attributed to the whole of life of a supply chain. And so therefore, a lot of the data that is being captured is in a high-level survey form, and or it's in different forms of data being structured and unstructured. And as we start to see the evolution of other technologies, combining that symphony effect that I was speaking about before, artificial intelligence, increased sensor technologies, plus blockchain, the symphony of these technologies will help to provide this additive approach to data collection and this additive approach to data measurements, which simply isn't mature today, but I'm hopeful it will be in the next number of years. So the recommendation across the line in any supply chain is to necessarily start with that digital twin in mind and enable that carbon footprint to ensure that there's company-specific data that is being collected. As we began this work in the diamond industry, it was very clear after 8 million gemstones on our platform, people asked the question to me, what enabled that network effect? And the answer was very clear. It was the alignment. It was the alignment of industry where each of the participants could enable themselves to, oh my God, I just got fatigue at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll skip that. I'll have to keep going. I'm so sorry. I'm exhausted. The lack of transparency and regulation to create supply chains is really driving, and the due diligence in the regulatory context is still in its early formation. But we're hopeful that this will be addressed in time. This supply chain itself, one of the biggest issues that we see is certainly in the assessment and the recommendation around consumer pre-waste, and then of course consumer post-waste, specifically for cobalt, nickel, lithium and lead. Lead batteries, of course, has been a long-standing position in the industry, and arguably lead acid batteries have been recycled for the better part of millennia. But when we think about the data attributes as it leads in for an end of life for lithium ion batteries, we're certainly nowhere near the level of technology required to be able to have a post-consumer recycle event that will take up all of the elements of the supply chain. I just thought I'd quickly play what an actual application looks like. I've got about 6 minutes here, and if we've got time, I'll just give it a shot.
When you and the team are pitching,
oh, sorry.
Grammarly's tone suggestions can offer a more personal.
The Everledger battery passport has been developed with the critical guidance and input of key industry organizations.
I think, Leanne, the sound's not quite working at the moment. But what we might do is if we can post that link into the chat, then everyone can take a proper look at it, if that's okay.
Yeah, I will do that. No problems.
Fabulous. That'd be fantastic. Thanks, Leanne. I know that we've got John Crawley with us here for his talk that was due to be happening right at this second. But I just wondered, Leanne, we've got one very quick question from Johannes, and he asks, how certain do we feel that any price premium will be available for those who comply with these new transparency requirements? What do you reckon?
We're not.
Great answer.
Yeah, we're not confident. What I'm more interested in is the end of life and who it's the race. The race is on for who's going to grab and who has the right to these critical minerals, particularly at its end of life cycling. And if you think about some governments are jostling even different lease right models for the extractives part of the industry, I think there's a burgeoning space of this end of life processing with recyclers and refurbishers, but it's very clear that the mid-tier of the market, whether it be the battery manufacturer themselves or the OEM, they too are making very clear stipulations of that end of life, that just because you've unscrewed the screw to disassemble the battery doesn't mean that that black mass is yours to have. And so I think that's the interesting disruptor in the industry, is where will that go? How will that play out? And therein lies the race is on. I don't think it's I think it's about who gets to grab the volume.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Leanne. And again, a fantastic talk, really giving us insight into what is going on in that world at the moment. So thank you very much. Round of applause for Leanne, everybody.